بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم نحمد ونصلي ونسلم على رسوله النبي الأمين وعلى آله وأصحابه وأتباعه أجمعين وبعد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. All thanks and praises are due to Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Salawat and salam be upon our noble leader and master Nabiyuna Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Dear respected beloved brothers and elders, last year November we dedicated 3 Jumu'ah talks to discussing the entry of Islam to South Africa via the Cape. In the first week, Qari Ridwan Babadeen had discussed the initial Muslims to arrive to the Cape with special focus on Sheikh Yusuf Makasa rahimahullah. In the second week, Mawlana Ibrahim Musa had taken us through the 2nd century of Islam in the Cape. It was at this time that we saw the establishment of the Awwal Masjid in Buka and the arrival of Qadi Abdullah bin Abdi Salam to Anguru rahimahullah. Then in the 3rd week we had discussed the arrival of the Ottoman scholar who was sent by the Khilafah to guide the Muslim community, and that was Abu Bakr Effendi rahimahullah. Over the course of today's discourse as well as next week, I wish to discuss a few facts and derive some reflections and lessons from the arrival of Muslims to Natal. So it was in about 1652, in the 1600s, that the earliest Muslims had arrived to the Cape. Around 100 years later, the first masjid was established in South Africa. That was the Buka Masjid in Cape Town, the Awwal Masjid. And 100 years later, the first Muslims arrived to Natal. So the first Muslims arrived to the coast of Durban 200 years after the initial Muslims had arrived to the Cape. The initial Muslims had arrived to Durban as indentured laborers. Now, to understand this, in 1830, slavery was abolished. So at this time, now shortly thereafter, they created a new form of slavery, and this was indentured laboring. And an individual would be promised to be taken out of his situation of poverty in his homeland. He would then be brought to a foreign land, to South Africa, and he would sign a contract of remaining in employment for 5 to 10 years like a slave, and in that way he was paying off the favor or the debt of actually bringing him back to this foreign land, to bring him into South Africa. So it was another form of slavery. So the initial Muslims had arrived from the Java island. So they were a small group of individuals. Thereafter we saw the year 1860. In 1860 now, this is when the commencement of indentured laborers from India, particularly from Madras, had arrived to South Africa. This was a very challenging time for the Muslims at that time, establishing themselves with a lack of resources. In fact, just a few days ago, on the 16th of November, was a day which they commemorated as Arrival Day. It's a day that is meant to create awareness regarding the struggles of the indentured laborers as well as their contributions to South Africa in terms of the economy, in terms of culture. They brought flavor to the Durban culture as well as their involvement in the liberation struggle. So this was on the 16th of November, and there is actually some activism taking place to create more awareness of this for the wider community to actually recognize the influence that the Indian community has had in Durban particularly, as well as within the wider South Africa. So amongst the initial individuals who had arrived at that time with the first group of indentured laborers was a man by the name of Sheikh Ali Vulay Ahmed. Sheikh Ali Vulay Ahmed, he is fondly known as Hazrat Badsha Pir, rahmatullahi alayh. Hazrat Badsha Pir, rahmatullahi alayh, may not have been a scholar per se. He had arrived as indentured laborer. After spending his time under employment, he had then decided not to return to India. He rather remained in South Africa. He did not remain in South Africa for business purposes. Rather, he did not even get married. He did not create a family. He spent most of his time in the masjid. So he was a very unassuming individual living with bare minimum. But what you would be seen doing was after Salah, you would be seen in the masjid seated with small groups of individuals, giving them some encouragement, talking about Allah and Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and educating them on some of the very basics of Islam. So this was Hazrat Badsha Pir rahmatullahi alayh, and he had passed away on the day of Jumu'ah at the time when the adhan of Jummah had taken place. So he was not a scholar per se, but he was a religious individual. Now there's two reflections from the life and the contribution of Hazrat Badsha Pir rahmatullahi alayh. The first is that Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam has said, رُبَّ أَشْعَثَ أَغْمَرَ مَدْفُوعٍ بِالْأَبْوَابِ لَوْ أَقْسَمَ عَلَى اللَّهِ لَأَبَرَّ. There are certain individuals who are such that they may be dusty, they may not look very well dressed, because of circumstances, not because of choice. So they may not be they may be unassuming. They are madfu'in bil abwab. If they have to knock at your door to ask for something, you wouldn't give them a second look, you would chase them away. لَوْ أَقْسَمَ عَلَى اللَّهِ لَأَبَرَّ. But they are such individuals that if they have to take an oath in the name of Allah, Allah will ensure the oath is fulfilled. If they have to take an oath in the name of Allah, Allah will ensure that the oath is fulfilled. There's an incident of at one time Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was seated with a few Sahaba. They were having their suhoor. The Sahabi, the name of Abdullah bin Maktoum radiallahu anhu, approaches, Ya Rasulullah, suhoor time has elapsed, it's the time of Fajr has entered. Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam says, no, we can continue eating, the time hasn't entered as yet. Abdullah bin Maktoum radiallahu anhu was blind, right? So there was a bit of a misjudgment here. Second time he comes, Ya Rasulullah, the time has elapsed of suhoor, the time of Fajr has entered, you need to stop eating. Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam informs those around him that no, the time hasn't entered as yet, we can still continue eating. The third time he comes, Ya Rasulullah, Wallah, the time of Fajr has entered. Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam tells Sahaba, you stop eating now. The time would have normally not entered. Abdullah bin Maktoum took an oath in the name of Allah. Allah made sure that the time of Fajr has entered. So at times there are certain individuals who are unassuming, but if they have to take an oath in the name of Allah, Allah will ensure that their oath is fulfilled. One example of that was Hazrat Badsha Pir rahmatullah alayh. The second reflection from his life and his contribution is that there are various forms of contributing to the upliftment and the success of a community. We understand and we acknowledge financial and physical contributions to the establishments and to our communities. One contribution that is very important as well is that of spiritual contribution to the community. There may be an individual who attends our musalla or attends a masjid. He may not be he might not have that financial ability to contribute significantly to the establishment of the masjid or for the running expenses of the masjid. But his attendance to the house of Allah is perhaps the reason that Allah Ta'ala is allowing that establishment to succeed and for that community to thrive. So there are individuals in our communities and their spirituality could be the means of the success of the community. So there are various forms of contributions to the community. At one time a Sahabi approaches, Ya Rasulullah, I've got an issue with my brother. I'm working whole day. I'm making so much of an effort, and my brother doesn't have any interest in business. He's only spending time in your company, Ya Rasulullah. Can you speak to him? Tell him to let's share it half-half. Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam replies to the Sahabi that لَعَلَّكَ تُرْزَقُ بِهِ. Perhaps you are given sustenance by Allah because of your brother's worship of Allah and the fact that you supporting your brother. So perhaps the barakah you are enjoying today is because of your assistance of your brother. And so this is in terms of the spiritual contribution that certain individuals bring to the table, bring to the community. So in 1860, indentured laborers had arrived. The African youth now goes home to India that there is business opportunities in South Africa. And so from 1869, now businessmen coming with large amounts of capital arrive to the port of Durban. And so they begin to establish businesses, and this now brings benefit to the community. One such individual was that of Abu Bakr or Jhavery, rahimahullah. His mention today is not because of his success in business. He did achieve success in terms of his business. He did very well for himself. The reason that we are mentioning him 100 years later is simply because of his contributions to Islam, his contributions to the Muslim community. First, he was in Transvaal, and thereafter he moves to Natal. In Natal, he finds that in Verulam, there is a Muslim community, but they did not have a place of Salah, and so he purchases a land in Verulam for a masjid to be established. So he purchases the land, a musalla is established. Currently, the masjid stands on that very same land. What rewards he must be getting, may Allah Ta'ala reward him and all those who had contributed. He thereafter moves to Durban. When he moves to Durban now, he finds that the Muslim community is performing salah in the home of a man by the name of Mr. K. Munsami. So he puts an offer to purchase, he purchases that land, and a musalla is established. Thereafter, they establish a fully fledged masjid, and this now becomes the Jumu'ah Masjid of Grey Street. This becomes the Jummah Masjid of Tracy. So in 1880, it was the Muslims performed Salah in the house of Mr. K. Munsami. In 1881, he purchases the property and he builds a Musalla. In 1884, it now becomes the Jummah Masjid. The Jummah Masjid of Grey Street becomes an iconic masjid, not for Islam itself, it becomes an iconic building in the Durban landscape itself. In the year 1904, the one minaret was built. In 1905, the second minaret was built. These two minarets become the tallest structures in Durban at its time. So we can imagine how it actually showed the presence of Muslims and their contributions, even though they were small in number at that time, percentage-wise at least. In 1943, the masjid goes through a major renovation and extension, and this makes the Grey Street Masjid the largest masjid in the southern hemisphere. Currently, the Nizamiya Masjid in Midrain perhaps is the largest masjid in South Africa, but until then, the Grey Street Masjid was the largest masjid, which some have said within the southern hemisphere. So that was the Grey Street Masjid. A kilometer away, the Anjuman Islam Jumu'ah Masjid is established, and this is known as the West Street Masjid. So a year later, just a kilometer away, the West Street Masjid is established. What was the need to establish a masjid just a kilometer away? The reason for this and the thought of the people at that time was that Abu Bakr Ahmed Jhavery, rahimahullah, he traced his origins to, he was a Memon in terms of culture, and the Memon community actually traced their ancestry back to Abdul Qadir al-Jailani, rahimahullah. So Abu Bakr Jhavery, rahimahullah, and those who worked with him, the trustees of the Grey Street Masjid, were Memon. Right? So now there was a Gujarati community of businessmen also in Durban, and so they saw the need now to establish their own masjid. Perhaps it was justified at that time due to the cultural differences, language differences at that time. So they established the West Street Masjid, which was primarily by members of the Randir community. You see, in Johannesburg, we still maintain some of the tradition. We say they Randeris. In Durban, they say they Rendris. Anyway, so that was by members of the Randir community. All right, let's take a step back and do some reflections. The first reflection I wish to share is in terms of the usage of the house of a Hindu individual, and this talks to us about an important aspect, and that is in every community, we as Muslims need to integrate very well into their society. We integrate without assimilation. Integrate without assimilation. So we integrate, be part of that community. It is unwise and it is definitely counterproductive for us to live in a vacuum and for us to live aloof from the rest of the community. We are within our community. We need to be involved in the activities of our community. For us living in Basonia and surrounding areas, we definitely need to be involved in the various activities that are taking place when it comes to the security, CPF, or any other activities within the community. We need to be not just involved, but at the forefront. In fact, I was reading now in terms of the arrival day that how the Indian community was actually actively involved in the various forms and the various departments of the African National Congress. And so they were actually actively involved in the liberation struggle. And so this is where we need to stand as well. At the very least, our message for today is that at least let us know our neighbors. At least let us know our neighbors and have some sort of a relationship with our neighbors. This is something that is a no-brainer. This is definite. We really need to work on that, and it doesn't even need a mention. Anyway, so that is in terms of integration. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions, لا ينهاكم الله عن الذين لم يقاتلوكم في الدين ولم يخرجوكم من دياركم أن تبروهم وتقسطوا إليهم. That Allah ta'ala has not prevented you from being kind, from being good and being just to those who are not at war with you. So the general community of South Africa, they may be non-Muslim, but they're not at war with Islam. So أَن تَبَرُّوا وَتُقْسِطُوا إِلَيْهِمْ. It is our responsibility to actually be kind, to be good, to be courteous towards them, and to be just towards them. So that is the first reflection. The second reflection is that we all call for community involvement. Community needs to be involved in the various activities in the community. However, we always require that individuals who can actually initiate initiatives and to push it forward. When we saw that there was a community in Verulam, there was a community in Durban, they were limited in terms of the resources. Abu Bakr Amod Jhavery rahimahullah, he is a man who had the resources, and so he initiates the masjid. Now the rest of the community will join in and they will support in their own capacities. So we need those individuals. We need people from amongst us who are seated here today. That there are so many initiatives that need to be established in our community. We need to take that lead. It is emotional intelligence and it is real mastery if a person knows I'm not fit to lead that initiative, but I can initiate it. I can initiate it. Once it's established, I'll pass it on to somebody who is more fit to be able to lead that particular campaign or that particular project. On one occasion, a Sahabi explains that a group of individuals enter Medina Munawwara, and these people were impoverished. They were barely clothed. So they were in a pitiable situation. Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam ascends the pulpit and he addresses the Sahaba radiallahu anhum, encouraging them to spend on these individuals, these guests to Al-Madinah Munawwara. So some money was coming in, some resources were coming in slowly, 1 dirham here, 1 dinar there, some money was coming in until one Sahabi enters into Al-Masjid al-Nabawi. He comes in with a large bag of resources, of gold, silver and other resources, so much that the Sahabi says he was barely able to carry that because of the weight, and he puts it in front of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. As soon as the other Sahaba see this contribution, they all get up, return home, and come back with whatever they were able to bring through. Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam yatahallalu wajhu. The Master sallallahu alayhi wa sallam's face was radiant. It was shining. He was so happy by the sight that in a few minutes' time, there was a heap of resources for these individuals. And Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam at this point says that man sanna sunnatan hasana falahu ajruha wa ajru man amila biha. That person who initiates good, he gets the reward for his action as well as all those who are inspired by his action. وَمَنْ سَنَّ سُنَّةً سَيِّئَةً. That person who initiates something incorrect, he gets the sin for doing the incorrect deed. وَأَجْرُ مَنْ عَمِلَ بِهَا وَوِزْرُ مَنْ عَمِلَ بِهَا. And all those who also take inspiration from him and do incorrect deeds, he will also bear the brunt of that. So that is a reflections of how we should initiate activities within our community. The next aspect that we look into is the aspect that no community, no society has been unchallenged. Every era and every area has gone through challenges. The first challenge that the Grey Street Masjid had experienced was that Abu Bakr Amod Jhavery rahimahullah had passed away at a young age. He had passed away at around 35 years old. After his demise, there was a bit of a challenge within the community as to the leadership and the trusteeship of the masjid. So we had some back and forth, and eventually a committee was decided. Thereafter, the second challenge that came in was that the trustees of the masjid were were those who were Myemen, right? But many of the congregants were Gujaratis or were Cockneys or were members who were from the indentured laborers, and so they wanted representation at management level. So this created a bit of a back and forth. Eventually, a committee was created consisting of the various representations of the community of Durban at that time. So that was the second challenge. The third challenge that they faced was that of the dealing with the Imam of the Masjid. So the Imam of the Masjid was Mawlana Fatih Muhammad. Mawlana Fatih Muhammad is described as as a charismatic, outgoing person who really led the community in an amazing way. He was involved in every part of the community. In fact, the day that he had passed away, the Jumu'ah, at 10 o'clock was his Janaza Salah. It said that every single Muslim businessman or every single Muslim business in Durban was closed for that entire Jumu'ah morning, all being part of the Janaza of Mawlana Fatih Muhammad, rahimahullah. So Mawlana Fatih Muhammad, he being a charismatic and outgoing person, one point he found some inconsistencies and incorrect dealings of the committee, so he brought it to them. And this put him into their bad books. So they now wanted to get rid of him. But the community refused to accept this. There was a period of almost 10 years that he did not receive remuneration for his services by the committee, but he received assistance, financial assistance from the members of the community. So this created a conflict within the community. Now, three lessons, or the reason that we mention these, perhaps not the best incidents to mention, is number one, is that every community goes through challenges. Every community goes through challenges. It's not the end of the world. That community will succeed. Islam itself is such that it is made for us to rise. The Muslim community will never be destroyed with one or two conflicts. Yes, perhaps in the world today or in our South African context, there may be some conflicts, but that doesn't mean it's the end of our 300-year legacy. We are still going to continue, inshallah, because that is what Islam has within its DNA. The second aspect is that this community was very new. They were coming from established Muslim lands. And so now to establish masjids, mistakes were inevitable. Mistakes were inevitable. The trick now is for us not to make those same mistakes. So first, in terms of the trustees of the masjid, I think it's very important that the members of a masjid or Islamic organizations need to be chosen based on merit. They need to be chosen based on merit, based on their Islamic foundation and their relationship with the masjid in the house of Almighty Allah. It shouldn't be that the person only becomes regular to the masjid after he gains position at management level. He needs to already be a person of the masjid before he is given that position of management of a masjid. He needs to also have a thorough Islamic knowledge, or at least the basics of Islamic knowledge need to be there for him to run a masjid or be part of the masjid. It is a major mistake that is made in many communities, is that of electing the trustees of the masjid based on their financial contributions, based on their ability to financially contribute. And this comes many times at a heavy price, that the negatives actually outweigh the benefits that that individual was able to contribute to that initiative or that establishment. The second is in terms of diversity. So our community is changing very rapidly. Over the last 30 years, we've seen major changes, and that needs to be reflected at our masjid levels as well and our Islamic organizations. It shouldn't be that the same status quo of 30 years ago still remains, that the same demographic, same types of people still leading the community. This needs to be, really need to continuously check up on the systems. The third reflection and aspect that we found was that last year we discussed that the challenge within the Masajid of Durban was that, or the Masajid in Cape Town rather, was that they weren't really businessmen who put up the masjid. It was the general people with meager resources. They all pooled their resources and they established the Masajid. And so those who assumed position of authority were the learned individuals, the Imams. The issue came in when the Imams were no longer uh, qualified. They were not sufficiently qualified, and this is when challenges entered into the community. When it came to the Masajid in Durban, the Indian run Masajid, that is when it was businessmen who established the Masajid. They then brought in scholars, Imams like Maulvi Fatih Muhammad from India, and they were now employed in the Masjid. Now, the only model of governance that they knew, being businessmen, was that of the business model. They ran it as Indian businesses. And so they ran the Masajid as Indian businessmen ran their businesses. And the Imam or the religious leaders were regarded as employees of that particular establishment. And this came at a very heavy cost. It came at the cost where they would dictate on the Imams what to say and what not to say, with the fear of actually being deported. They would be at times even taken to task for not greeting the chairman in the correct manner. And unfortunately, the reality is that although we have come a far way, this hasn't completely left our masajid. We, in a particular instance, I'll give you an example of a masjid that had employed a few imams instead of one imam, and then they rotated those imams between a few masajid, and the chairman said that I do this so that no imam assumes that position of being a head imam and have a position in the masjid. So they didn't want the imam to actually contest their position as the mutawallis, as the trustees of the masjid. Now, yes, it may have secured their position, but it actually came at a cost of the community, where the community did not have that ulama leadership. So that is some lessons that we could derive from there. Inshallah, next week we'll discuss some aspects related to the Sufi Sab Masjid in Riverside, inshallah. And I wish to just make a disclaimer, because Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam said that shaitan runs in our blood, or shaitan can affect us just as blood runs in our body. This was in no way a message or shots fired at the current committee of this musalla. Alhamdulillah, because of my relationship, I was able to discuss some of these pertinent issues. We ask of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant us the understanding.